welcome back, everybody, to the Unfounded Podcast. I'm very excited to be back here with you so soon. Thankfully, after the last episode, no more hiatuses. I am back at it. So at the very least, I'm going to be trying to bring you an episode once a week, and we'll see how it goes from there. I'm going to keep it simple and not put too much stress on myself. As we move into this new season, it's been a season of healing for me, a long journey, as you all found out last episode. Uncovering parts about myself that were very uncomfortable. But I'm glad to report that since doing that last episode, this last week, I've been going through a lot of release. And if any of you were going through that with me, as I was kind of speaking about any of those things, I hope that you are experiencing that same kind of release or relief. Even more detail, memory. I started to remember more details about the memories that I was speaking of in that podcast. So as we unlock the parts of ourselves that are hurt, as we start to look into those places, you'll find that's where the pieces that you feel you've lost of yourself are hidden, right? The parts of yourself that feels broken, that's where it is, right? And I'm here to tell you that because I'm starting to find myself again as I uncover those things. And it's a beautiful experience, and it starts to put context into the term awakening, for me at least, right? You start to understand why people talk about these things in these ways throughout history. But that is not the topic for today's episode. It is a very heated topic, and one that I've been wanting to cover for a very long time. I'm very excited to. I'm going to dive into the Gaza conflict, specifically the Israeli-Palestinian debate, and more specifically, the history of it, kind of how it looks in the modern day, how the debate looks right now. And then I want to go backwards and kind of see where it stems from, right? Because from what I've been seeing as I've been trying to understand what's going on, and what I've been feeling, I guess, at least, is that I can't make sense of anything, because everybody's accusing everybody of being not just like a bad guy, but like the worst guy, right? With the worst intentions. Everybody's approaching it with bad intent. And so I can't trust any one person or any one side. And you may notice this in many modern conflicts, regardless of what the conflict is over. It's devolved to this place of villainizing the other person, the other group of people, the other idea, whatever it is, and then making them into the devil itself, so that you can justify whatever actions you deem fit against them, and you can do it in a holy name, right? This is the fundamental problem, and is not one that lies only with the Muslims or only with the Jews or only with the Christians. It lies with all of us. Because that is the justification for some of the worst atrocities throughout history if you are a student of it. And no religion is guiltless in that, right? So, that's how I'd like to lead into this first video that I have for you. There's quite a few of them today that I've gathered, and they're all slightly different versions of these perspectives, right? But what I want to start out with is one that Dr. Phil actually, and it was just a recent episode that he did. If any of you are familiar with Dr. Phil, you may have realized that he is starting to really dive into some controversial topics and speak his mind. And it's a beautiful thing to watch, because a man that has been in front of us, that we've grown up with, many of us, and has been there to guide us through some hard times, some psychological issues. Many of us have watched Dr. Phil for advice. And so him kind of taking more stringent stances on certain topics doesn't speak about the truth of any topic he's talking about, but the truth of the process he is demonstrating. Of having those conversations and speaking what you believe regardless of what it is, so that we can know what you believe and we can really see who you are, right? This first video is a clip of his recent show where he had, I forget his name, forgive me, but a man that you'll see here opening the video. He is, from what I understand, the son of one of the leaders of Hamas, right? He's been a very popular figure over the last 6 months because he's been speaking out against Hamas, right? Being someone that grew up in that system, he has intricate knowledge of how it operates and also the ideology behind it. And so he's been coming out, speaking out against specifically a lot of the protests against Israel. So he opens the video with fairly heated, and he's speaking to two young women who are pro-Palestine, right? Who are speaking on the from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free motto, right? And so this is just kind of to set up what the video is. That's what we're starting off with. But as you can see, it demonstrates quite well how heated the debate is and how neither side is listening to the other. Without further ado.
If you were a decent human being, you can say that the thousands were killed on October 7. That was a crime against humanity. It was a genocide.
When you guys are trying to say that we are calling for the eradication of the Jewish people because we're Muslim or because that is in our charter and in our belief, and misconstruing our holy book and saying that we're calling for the death of Jews, when we have not once ever said that, and we have openly stated that a liberated free Palestine means the safety of the Jewish people as well, that is inaccurate, and that is trying to mislabel and misrepresent the Palestinian movement.
That is what Hamas has made very clear. From the river to the sea.
No, from the river to the sea means you have the Jordanian River, the Mediterranean Sea, the land in between is free. Everyone in between is free. I am not going to allow you guys to try and use Hamas's words and say that's my words.
I'm not saying those are your words. I'm saying that Palestine has elected Hamas as their leader.
But see, in the same breath, we're saying that we do not want the Palestinian cause to be associated or to begin and end with Hamas, because Hamas is a creation of Israel, and we know it to be a militant group that's unsustainable.
That's
and
false.
No, it's true.
That's your narrative.
Israeli
That's your
officials have
narrative.
literally said, you know,
That's
we can look
false.
it up after.
That's false. You cannot convince someone who was born in the Hamas leadership.
It's objectively true. If they literally said it themselves.
You can convince
That's
everyone
okay.
else. I am
Okay.
not buying this, and I'm not
So
buying you from the river to the sea.
So we're trying
from
to
the
dis-
river to the sea is a genocide call against Israel. So please don't sugarcoat it.
So, as I'm sure you can see there, give me 1 second, apologies. I have there we go. I had an issue recording. I forgot to start recording on my other part. So we're good to go now. Anyway, as you can see there, it's a very heated debate. And both sides are so heated that even if you watch the video, if you look in their eyes as they're speaking, you can see this glaze, right? And this intensity as they look at each other, right? That there's a viciousness underlying that, this animal thing, right? This part of us that is getting defensive and wanting to protect ourselves because these ideas that we're speaking of are so deeply rooted that they trigger that fight or flight instinct inside of us. Right? You can watch this happen. This debate is triggering that in people all over the world. And in many ways, depending on how your ideology leading into this conflict, that kind of right now is coloring where you fall in this conflict, right? And that's kind of where it's so confusing, because the consistency is going out the window kind of on both sides in different ways, right? With the liberal side kind of really getting behind this Palestinian movement, this motto, like I said earlier, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and mobilizing the political force, the social force behind that they've developed over the last 10 years, these grassroots movements, the colleges. You see this exploding over the last week specifically, sit-ins and people holding protests, specifically young, adults. And so this conflict seems to be getting worse, specifically based on the ways in which we were already divided, right? It's dividing us further. And the reason it's dividing us further is because the ideas we have to double down on are less logical. They're less logically consistent. So it's forcing us to ignore more about who we are, about where we're wrong. As we do that, we start to enable that fundamental egotistical thing inside all of us, the thing that wants power, the thing that wants to show the other person that they're wrong, right? The thing that wants to tyrannically force the world to see its perspective. And you see this being inspired on both sides in different ways. So that's kind of how I wanted to open up the podcast, just to set the stage, because as we go through these videos, we're going to be presented different versions of these ideas, and I want to try to engage with them honestly. So whatever end of the spectrum you sit on right now, wherever you fall right now in that argument we just watched, I want you to try to look at yourself, take yourself out of the first person perspective, and to watch yourself as we move through this podcast, and to try to specifically find those places of logical inconsistency. You'll know when you find one, because it can make you feel a lot of negative emotion. So if you start to feel yourself get frustrated, angry, even cursing out loud, or starting to attack other people, that's a signifier that the subject you're speaking about, the thing that you're talking about, you have missed something, right? Because that is not supposed to be inspired towards another human being that's just expressing themselves, right? You're not right fundamentally in that way. You can't be. You're not the entire universe, right? That's the truth. There may be a piece of what you're saying that is true, as with them, but obviously, hence the conflict, there's something we're both not seeing. This is what we need to approach it with. This is how the level at which we need to approach these conflicts and conversations, because if we don't, we will never see where we're going wrong, and we'll continue to go down the road of violence, this animalistic side of ourselves. We'll continue to leverage that until we destroy not only ourselves and the people that we hate so much, but the world in that process. So let's move on a little bit and see a little bit. Let's dig into the topic a little more and learn a little bit more about each perspective. I have people that speak on both sides that I have found are well-spoken, at least as well-spoken as I could find, as fair as I could be on both sides, so I can present the ideas. So this is an explanation of the modern conflict, and it's going to explain the perspective from kind of the turn of the century, right? And this is how you probably have heard it explained up until this point, right? The history of the modern world. Why is Israel a state? And why do people disagree with the Zionist, as they refer to it, agenda? So let's watch.
Basically, Zionism starts in the late 1800s. This is when the first Zionist writers start. And it starts mostly by, or maybe exclusively, but definitely mostly by Eastern European Jews. And Zionism was a reaction, in my opinion, a very understandable reaction to the pogroms. Which, like, dude, if you ever want to not be able to sleep at night, go read about the history of the pogroms. It's the most disturbing thing in the world.
I'm not aware of it at all.
Okay, so basically, there would be over and over and over again, there were waves of what you would just describe as kind of state allowed, in some cases state sanctioned, just waves of mass violence against Jewish people in Eastern Europe. And if you think like the like if you're in the dark recesses of the internet and you see some like anti-Jewish conspiracy, and you might kind of like roll your eyes at it and be like, this is pretty stupid. But the stuff back then, it was like a virus would come in and they would accuse the Jews of practicing black magic, and that's why everyone's getting sick from this virus. So like, try arguing your way out of that one. You know what I mean? Like,
what year is this? What time period?
This is happening all throughout the 1600s, 1700s, and into the 1800s. There are waves of it over and over again. And it's like, I mean, I'm talking about where like they would just storm Jewish areas and like literally the stuff that'll give you nightmares. I mean, it's like just rip your baby apart in front of you, rape your wife, make you watch, and then beat you to death afterward. And this happened over and over and over again. And so the early Zionists were basically like, they were like, we can't live like this anymore. Like, we can't live with this just like waiting for the next pogrom to happen. So we're not doing this anymore, and what we need is a Jewish homeland. And that was kind of their conclusion. And you can totally see where that's a totally reasonable conclusion in the face of that type of violence. Now, there were lots of other Jews who disagreed with them. There were lots of Jews, in fact, at the time, the only opponents of Zionism were Jews, because they were the only ones who knew about this plan anyway. It was only a small group of people. But they were kind of like, well, no, you're giving in to the same anti-Semitic narrative that we're trying to fight. Like, because they'd be saying things like, look, we are different and we need to remove ourselves from society. And they're like, no, that's what they're saying. We disagree with that. We just want to be, members of the society we live in, and we just want our like equal rights. But anyway, the Zionists took off. One of the things that's really interesting, if you read the early Zionist writings, they did not talk much about Arabs. This is something Daryl Cooper did a really good job of covering in his series, by the way. But they were not talking about Arabs. They very rarely mentioned them. It was like they kind of picked Israel because that was the place in their holy book. You know what I mean? And that was like the history of, oh, this is where we started in Israel. Like those are our holy sites. But none of the early Zionists had been to Israel. Or Palestine at the time. They had never been to this area. They were just like, this is the one in our holy book, so like, let's do it there. And they don't talk much about Arabs. When they do, they speak of them in pretty friendly terms. They liked the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was a lot cooler to the Jews than the Russian Empire, where most of these Jews lived. And they liked them. The Ottoman Empire tended to let Jews practice their religion and work and stuff like that. And so their enemy was Europeans. That's in the early Zionist writing. The bad guy is the Europeans who keep oppressing us. And then they're like, look, like, they basically started organizing to like, let's get people to go move to Palestine and start a life there. And over the years, they started to gain some influence over like some really wealthy Jewish financiers to kind of like back
this is in what time period?
It starts in the late 1800s, and then it kind of gets going in the first, say, like 15 years of the 20th century. They start building a little bit of momentum. They start raising more money. More Jews start settling in Palestine, and things were relatively peaceful there for the beginning. There were incidents here and there, but like relatively speaking, the Jews who lived in Palestine, there were Arab Christians and Arab Muslims, and they lived there, and it wasn't like a disaster. And then things started getting much worse during and particularly after the First World War. So in the First World War, the Ottoman Empire goes to war with the British Empire. And there were others involved as well. But the Ottomans and the British Empire are fighting each other. And it's the First World War. There's never been anything like it before in human history. It's the biggest war at the time ever. And it was very in doubt who was going to win. I mean, like the German military was, I think, viewed as the toughest at the time. Certainly their subs were like way more advanced than the other countries in there. And Britain is pretty desperate at this point. So the British, they cut a deal with some of the Arab nations. So the Arabs are being ruled by the Ottoman Empire at this point. So the British convince them to rise up and fight against the Ottoman Empire. And then they say, if you do that, we'll grant you your independence when the war is over and we've won. But then at the same time, they also released the Balfour Declaration, this is in 1917. This is in the middle of World War I. And they write this Balfour Declaration to the Rothschilds, who were like a crazy rich, powerful banking family, and because they were Zionists. And so they write this letter, or they were pro the Zionist cause. And so he writes this letter that says like, it pleases the king that there should be a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So, but he also said in the declaration that with respect to the rights of the non-Jewish people there. So it's kind of vague, but it was kind of like the king basically saying like, hey, Rothschilds, we could really use some money for this war, so here's like a declaration that like will support a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And then they also promised the French Syria when the war is over. So they basically were just promising anyone whatever they can if you help our war effort. And it's just like, we got to win this war, we'll figure it all out after that. So then after the war, there's all of these different groups who kind of feel entitled to it because they were promised. And so the British Empire, the Ottoman Empire collapses after the war, they lose. Then the British Empire takes control, and they take control from the end of World War I up until 1947. And so the land was, under the control of European empires for hundreds of years. But if you ask me, that's not really what counts. Like, what really counts is like who was living there.
So, kind of a long video there, but a very informative one by Dave Smith, I believe is his name. Very interesting person, very well-informed person, somebody that I disagree with quite often, actually, but somebody that's nevertheless fascinating to listen to and very well-versed on a wide range of topics. So the short history that he gives us there kind of, like I said, gives us context into the recent past on why is everybody so angry over this plot of land, right? And what he goes in there to kind of give you a synopsis of it, to sum it all up, is that essentially at the beginning of this period, around the late 1800s, there was a large group of Jewish people in Russia. And there was I forget the name of the people that he referred to, but it's a well-known, horrendous kind of period in history where the Jews were brutalized. And this is something that happened kind of around the world leading up to this that we'll learn later, but specifically when some of the worst cases happened in Russia, right, pre-1900. And so this is one of the issues, this treatment, as he goes in to describe, that split not only the Jewish people and their position on how to deal with that problem, but also the entire world on what to do about that problem, because you had a group of immigrants, essentially, that had been emigrating throughout this area for the last 1,000 years. And so nobody knew what to do with them, essentially, is what they're outlining. So at this period of time, an idea was formed. This is where the idea of Zionism comes from, right? To return the Jewish people to their homeland, their traditional homeland, that is described in their religious texts and many other religious texts. So one of the reasons for the location of Israel, as we'll learn in more depth later, is this idea that is their traditional homeland, specifically the area where Israel is current day and parts of Palestine, modern day. So or what we call Palestine, modern day. And so what's interesting about that is there's areas in that telling, and this is not necessarily a criticism of Dave himself. He's doing the best he can with the knowledge he has, right? But where there's parts of that history that's kind of skipped over very quickly when you hear versions of this modern history of the plight of the Jewish people told. Specifically, why they were in those regions is skipped over. Right. One of the fundamental arguments that we will hear very shortly against the existence of Israel as a state is that the creation of Israel as a state pushed or dislodged the people that were originally there. These are the people that we're referring to as Palestinians modern day. And as we'll see and learn more later in the episode, there is a level of this that is true, right? As we just learned with Dave, that after World War I, the Ottoman Empire was destroyed. That was one of the countries that was completely destroyed and was divided up, which is partially why he was describing the British going to these different individual leaders and promising them states, right, after the war is over. Partially how they got Ottoman Empire to disband completely is through getting those different individual leaders within the Ottoman Empire to rebel against that state. So you can see how complicated this gets very quickly. At the same time, you have that same British Empire joining or speaking with this group of Jewish people who is experiencing this plight in Russia and trying to solve a problem of where to put them, right? So as World War I, and this is something that's well known to most historians, that World War I, one of the fundamental things it did is it changed the map forever. More countries go away after World War I than any other time in history that I'm aware of, right? The map completely changed. Whole cultures disappeared, right? Purely based off of the spoils of that war, right? When Germany lost, when the Ottoman Empire lost, the victors, those Allied forces, they weren't called the Allied forces, I don't believe, but you have, the British, and you have the French, and you have the US, and you have, I forget what other countries, but those are the main ones, right? Having total power to decide how to draw the new map. It's not that they decided to delete those countries, it's that with the culmination of the war, those countries were deleted. There was nothing there anymore, right? There was no government. The government had been taken out of power through this war. And so you have to do something. And who is going to do something with this huge map? Who's going to decide how to draw the lines again? The people who win. It's a logical progression, right? And that's what happened. And you hear Dave explain this, I think, in a fairly balanced way. The difference you'll find when you hear that story is in how it's told. Pay attention to how that story is told, because what I often hear is that story told with a certain amount of malice, kind of purposefully imprinted on the Allies, on the British, on the US, on the French, as they're making these decisions, which may be true, but is not something we could ever know for sure, the motivations, right? What we can know for sure is the action and what precipitated it, right? And when we look at it through that, there's a logical progression and there's a necessity to recreate states. And you have a mass group of people that don't have a home. So what they did is they took those people and they established the state of Israel, right? I believe I got sidetracked when I was explaining it. So going back into the story, the British had made these deals with these different leaders. They also made deals with the Zionists, this sect of the Jewish population that believed that they should have an Israeli state. This links very deeply to their religious text that we'll get into later, as I said. That was the idea that was ran with. He describes that it was backed by money as they kind of allied themselves with certain very influential families. And this is where it gets almost kind of conspiratorial, because there's this idea that there was, again, this malice underneath, that the idea was to defraud people of their lands, right? It was to take away something that other people had on purpose, right? And to do it, to punish them in almost sort of way. That's what it sounds like when it's described. And I personally, when I look at the story, don't see that. What I see is people making decisions in the moment that hindsight would probably argue against, but that's something that they don't have in the moment. They don't have the benefit of what we have looking backwards, hindsight. They can't judge their own character in the moment as well as we can retrospectively, and so they make the best decision they can, trying to do what they can. So it's kind of you see how we're progressing through this a little bit. We're getting a little deeper into what's going on here, right? But what I want to do now is kind of actually go and look at each side's argument more specifically. And these are going to be the more biased versions of the argument, right? So you can hear and see where the gaffes are that I'm talking about in the story, right? You can hear and see what's being said and what isn't being said very selectively, very specifically. And more specifically, if you pay attention to the state, the emotional state that people are in when they are arguing for these points, it will tell you before you even hear them talk. If you're ever trying to figure out whether you should trust somebody that's speaking, their emotional state will tell you everything you need to know before they even say a word, right? You can feel it. Just tune into that. You can tell whether you can trust what they're saying. All right. Without further ado, this is the modern Jewish perspective. Now, this is by no means the perspective, but this is one example of somebody speaking on a modern Jewish perspective of this conflict. So,
every single thing that you just said is untrue. The Jews were the original nation, hundreds and hundreds of years before Islam was even invented. Basically, the precursor of the United Nations, the League of Nations, decided that as a matter of international treaty obligation, the British would be given custodianship of Palestine, called the Mandate, under which Britain would be under a binding treaty obligation to return the Jews to their ancestral homeland to recreate it. Now, what was Palestine at the time? Well, a bit of it, a very large chunk of it, was promptly given away to the Arabs by Winston Churchill to become Transjordan, which is now Jordan. So what did that leave as the territory within which Britain had a binding duty to return the Jews as a matter of historic right? What was that territory? It is what is now Israel, what is called the West Bank, and Gaza.
And if you think about it, what they really...
Okay, so, and I cut the last part off there because that's just him kind of talking about his perspective. So you can see there right away, after we watched the other videos to start this off, exactly kind of some of the history that we already know about, are familiar with, is being spoken of, but passed through or passed by very quickly, right? It's almost like, don't question these parts of the history, right? Because this is how it went, right? And that's why we believe what we believe. But that is the problem, right? Is in the way that we're stating what we believe, because we're stating it as if it is the truth, the only truth, which is something that disallows anybody else to even have an opinion about it being different, right? It's the way that we're saying these things that is causing a lot of the problem. from that perspective, if I had to kind of, from my own opinion, what I know right now, poke and prod and maybe find a hole in, it's in the mandate aspect of it, right? Because from what Dave was speaking about earlier, the mandate was something that came about through a conspiring of sorts with different individuals of power, different families with means, right? So that this mandate was something that, because people with means tend to have the ability to make law, right, or mandates, this circular process happened in which this Zionist or Jewish argument for an Israeli state was what's the right word? Latched onto by certain very powerful people in positions of power that could make it a mandate. So that it was then mandated that the British had to do this, which then in the mandate grants justification over the whole argument, right? It kind of says if there's a mandate, then these states agree that the argument that these group of people are bringing is the one that's correct, so that we must return them to their holy land, to their homeland, as they say, right? So, and again, I'm trying to be devil's advocate here. I'm actually not speaking about specifically what I believe. I'm trying to be as open-minded as I can and steelman the issue somewhat so that I can try to see the other perspective, because I believe that's where somebody that was arguing for a Palestinian state would poke holes in that argument, right? So that's the modern Jewish kind of argument for the conflict that's going on right now and why the Israeli state is justified being there without going into deeper context historically, right? Let's look at the modern Muslim perspective.
There was
again the best that I can find.
Ukraine and Russia, and there was the Western Jews in Europe. Those people in the Eastern Jews had to immigrate because there were pogroms and they were kicked out. And at a certain point, the people in the West, especially in England, it's like, there are too many Jews. We need a solution. A solution for what? For the Jewish problem. So it's like we need to get rid of them. And you know what? Palestine was not even in the A list. Palestine was in the B list. Because England proposed 6,000 square miles in Uganda for the Jews, 1903. And the reason why Palestine was not on the list, that it was objected by a lot of rabbis that said, it's a promised land, but only when the Messiah comes. But there were other options: Argentina, South Africa, Uganda, Madagascar. And eventually they said, all right, let's do Palestine. So they went to Palestine in 1914. There was 700,000 people living in Palestine, 3% were Jewish. 1917, Balfour Declaration. Arthur Balfour, he called the Jewish people in England that they are alien and hostile race. And the thing is, the only Jewish member of the parliament, of the English parliament, Lord Montenegro, he objects, these are British citizens, we should not kick them out. So they pushed them, but it was not going fast enough. Came the Nazis. And then it was not about the solution anymore. It was the end losing, the final solution by Hitler, because he needed an answer for the Jewish question, the Judefrage. And then, as you see, the Holocaust happened, the most orchestrated, industrialized, horrible genocide in our modern time. 6 million Jews died. So it accelerated, and they went. First of all, they left East Europe, and they went to West Europe, and they went to America, and they were turned down, and they were pushed towards Palestine. So by 1948, right before the declaration of the State of Israel, there were 2 million people living there. Only 30% of them was Jews. So the whole idea of a land without a people to a people without a land, it was a marketing thing. They were already Palestinians. So suddenly, from our perspective, the Jewish problem is not a Jewish problem, is not a Middle Eastern problem, is not an Arab problem, it is a European problem. It was pushed on us together with the guilt, because now we are the anti-Semite. Now we are the Jewish hater. And not just that, they took land. So people look at this like, why are we even, we had a lot of refugees coming in.
So there's a little more depth into that exact same issue, but from the Palestinian perspective, right? And it is very interesting going back and forth, because as I tried to steelman the Jewish perspective, I'll do the same on the Palestinian one, right? One of the things that I keep on coming back to when I hear this argument is there's a fundamental, and this is true in life itself, but we don't know what to do like for instance, at the end of a war, we've never known what to do with the side that loses, right? War is a horrible thing to begin with, right? It doesn't make any sense on the surface. And then when you get to the end of it, it's produced a certain kind of chaos that you can't make sense of, right? And so you try to make sense of this chaos, this soup that you've created afterwards of people in pain. And the people that are experiencing the most of it are the people that have lost that war, that conflict, right? They're left in that chaotic soup. And the people that won are now given a certain amount of autonomy over deciding the future of those people. And this pain is what I'm speaking of. This is the pain that I hear coming out of this argument, right? Is the pain of a people that were conquered. And then the decisions that were made after that happened was something that hasn't been healed. The pain of that hasn't been healed, so that the bitterness has crept into the people at a very fundamental level. And this is manifesting itself as a certain type of hatred towards the group that they view as the people that did it to them, right? Which is partially why I speak of this malice in the way that we describe some of these situations or the plight of the other side. Oftentimes I'm hearing the Jewish perspective described as if they are conquerors, right? Specifically, this idea of I can't remember the term right now for some reason, but you get the idea of trying to conquer lands and expand your empire, and that there's this colonization, right, idea that the Jewish people are doing that to the Palestinian people, and creating apartheid state in the process, which I don't believe is fair when you actually look at the history, because I don't see anybody in the Jewish state that ever planned to do that or spoke of doing that to those people, right? While that may in some ways have been the effect of the decisions, trying to identify those people as the problem does nothing but make the conflict worse and produces more war, conflict, and that chaotic soup that I spoke of, right? So you go deeper into the problem and it gets less organized. The only way that I can see that you get through something like this is for both sides to recognize their part in creating that chaotic soup. For the side that came out with a certain amount of power and autonomy in the decision-making process after the fact, to be humble enough to recognize that they have a duty at a human level to recognize the plight of the people that they have conquered. Because you have never conquered a person as a human, maybe as a citizen of that state or the state itself, but you cannot conquer a human being. They are a soul, they are divine, and they deserve that respect. If you deny them that respect, this is what you get afterwards, right? And this is some of the hypocrisy that is coming out of the Zionist movement. It needs to be recognized because it is a certain way in which the Jewish people are wrestling with God, right? A statement that we'll get deeper into a little later, but that's very, very meaningful. Sorry, I had to verify my live here for a second because I got a live going on here. Any of you that do want to see like behind the scenes of the podcast and watch me, hang out with me while I'm creating the podcast, follow me on TikTok. I'm doing lives now while I do the podcast show. So without further ado, let's get back into it. You can see how there's a lot of pain wrapped up in this conflict. You know, if you are compassionate, you will feel for both sides of this in deep ways. That's partially why we don't open up that compassionate side of ourselves to this conflict, right? Is because in order to, you have to recognize that both the Palestinian people, the people that have called that place home for thousands of years, and the Jewish people who also called that place home for thousands of years, have both experienced pain, torment, torture on a scale that is hard to conceptualize. And what's harder to understand is that they've both been the cause, in many ways, of each other's pain. So in many ways, what this conflict is about is finding out who started it, right? It always comes back to that. It's no different than when you were arguing on the playground. They pushed me first, right? This is where the fundamental principles of religion are demonstrated as true if they're enacted. The fundamental principles of faith, not religion. I misspeak. because the principles of faith would have you act differently than what is being done right now in the world. The principles of faith would have you act with compassion towards your fellow man, not with ignorance towards them and malice, bad intent. What I want to do now is go a little deeper into Jewish history, right? Because I feel I've done a fairly good job at this point of being steel banding both sides and trying to bring us to a point where we're viewing both sides as equal, right? I do believe there is context to this argument that has been left out that needs to be understood properly so that we can understand what is going on in totality. The history of the Jewish people is one that is very controversial because it is tied up with the religious belief, the spiritual belief of the Jewish people. So the history of the Jewish people and the belief of the Jewish people are the same thing. This is also deeply ingrained in Christianity. So it's not just the Jewish people, it is other faiths as well, all over around the world, that treat their religious texts as historical texts. Now, this isn't just the religions that do that. These are the cultures that those texts come from. So these texts didn't start as Christian texts, as Jewish texts. These texts started as ancient texts, right? And were culminations of the most important knowledge in those societies, written down. You didn't write something down into stone unless you really meant it, because it took a lot of work. Right? So what we have in these books is a history, and that's a very important understanding, especially for anybody that isn't religious, didn't grow up in a religious setting, or isn't Jewish, or isn't Muslim, or isn't Christian. You have to understand that perspective, and this is a large part of the world, so don't feel bad about that, because most of the world, I believe, is secular modern day. That's what we've been led towards. This is a history. This is the human history. The story of religion, not one religion, but all religion, is the story of human beings. But it's the part that was way back in the past, right? It's the part of the telephone game that it's been thousands and thousands and thousands of people, so that by the time we hear our end of the story, it doesn't even really feel real anymore, right? Because it's been passed along so many times. That doesn't mean it's not real, right? This is very important to understand, and at least open your mind up to the concept of that. These texts are historical documents. If you view them as historical documents, you'll start to understand this conflict and why it's happening, I believe. It's a religious war that is going on right now, and it has been going on for a very long time, continuously. What we are seeing now is the culmination of that war. But the idea that this war started at the end of World War I is so ignorant of the past that all it can produce is more of the same, and that's exactly what it's doing, right? That should be obvious to all of us sitting here right now, right, watching this conflict unfold. That obviously nothing is getting better, it's getting worse, and everybody's saying the same thing, so somebody's wrong, or maybe both, right? Let's learn a little bit about Jewish history. This is going to take a little while. These are about 14 minutes altogether, all three of the videos, but it is important to get through and to sit through and to understand, especially if you do not have that fundamental mooring in some type of religion that treats this text as history. If you haven't engaged with it before or been taught it, it's important to learn so we can understand this. Anyway, without further ado.
So let's start first of all with the question, who are the Jews? Well, it's easier to say who they are not than to say who they are, actually. There are about 15 million Jews living around the world today, primarily in the land of Israel and in the United States, but also in many, many other countries, virtually every other country in the world. They are not a race. If you go to modern Israel, you'll see Jews of many different racial backgrounds, whatever that means exactly. They're not even a religion because, according to Jewish thought, even when a Jew decides to adopt another religion, they still retain Jewish identity. Well, there's a lot more to say about that, but this is under 18 minutes. They don't have a common language. I'm speaking to you in English, for example, and they don't have a common geography because, of course, Jews are scattered around the world. However, they do have a historical common language, which is, of course, Hebrew, and a historical common land, which is Israel, but we'll return to that shortly. So then what is the Jewish people? I think the easiest way to define them is really what the great 10th century philosopher Saadia Gaon called the unity of the Jewish people is in the Torah. It is their connection to the Torah that keeps the Jewish people together. Now, it's also true that many Jews struggle against the Torah, and that is also endemic to the entire Jewish condition, as the very name Israel, if you have a look in the book of Genesis, the very name Israel means one who struggles with God. Okay, lots more to say about this, but we are going to rush through 18 minutes. So let's look at the historical origins of the Jewish people. Our best source for ancient Jewish history is without a doubt the Bible. It is also the most difficult source to work with. As archaeologists will tell you, it's very difficult to line up the kinds of things that they are slowly discovering about the ancient Middle East with the text of the Bible. But that, again, we're sticking to 18 minutes here, so that will not detain us. There are a few scraps of information from the ancient period, like, for example, this amazing stele from Merneptah, a pharaoh from the 13th century, who famously wrote, "Israel is wasted, its seed is no more." Now, if you had a look at Merneptah's mummy, you'll see that he's not doing so great himself. But nevertheless, there are only a few scraps of information about the Jews in the ancient world, and much of their distant origins are lost in the mists of history, except for the Bible, which gives a very detailed account, however problematic it is for historians. According to the Bible, the Jews first emerged from Mesopotamia. The patriarch Abraham and Sarah lived in the region of what would be today Iraq, and they follow the Fertile Crescent up into what would be today Syria, and then they descend into Israel proper. They make some temporary sojourns in Egypt, but it is only under their grandson Jacob with his large family that the Jews actually move there en masse and are eventually enslaved. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with, of course, the famous story of the Exodus, which is the second book of the Bible, and that talks about how the Jews enslaved cry out to their God, who sends a redeemer, Moses, and then brings them out of Egyptian servitude, having them wander in the desert for a while until they finally cross over into the land of Israel. Archaeologists posit several other models for how the Jews may have actually settled the land of Israel, but there's no question that by the time you get to about the year 1000 BCE, there's a significant Jewish presence in the region of Israel. They've established a major religious site in Jerusalem where the temple is located, and they go through, as described in the Bible, a series of kings, some civil wars that ultimately end in the 8th century before the Common Era with a major invasion from the north that takes away the 10 northern tribes, essentially. They're the lost tribes of Israel. And then in the 6th century before the Common Era, then there's another invasion that takes away the southern region. Now, neither of these exiles, by the way, are total. There are still Jews that are living in the land of Israel, but the Jewish Commonwealth is destroyed. There's no more Jewish political entity at that point. The Babylonian exile only lasts for a few decades, however, and under Ezra, as described once again in the Bible, the Jews return to Israel. They reestablish the temple in Jerusalem that had been destroyed in the 6th century, and they begin the second Commonwealth period. The most important historical event that begins to happen in this period, the second return to Israel, is when Alexander the Great emerges from Macedonia and creates this massive empire that stretches all the way from Greece throughout the eastern Mediterranean down to Egypt and way out to Afghanistan. And he brings with him Greek culture called Hellenism. The Jews love Hellenism. They go crazy for it. It's got so many amazing things for it, but the problem is they have a difficulty figuring out how much Hellenism could be absorbed by Jewish culture without completely capitulating to Greek influence. And as a result, there is a major upheaval in the 2nd century, which is really a civil war between traditionalists on the one hand and Hellenists on the other. And this is called the Hanukkah Rebellion. And ultimately, the traditionalists win. They reestablish the traditional worship in the temple, which had been defiled by Greek gods and so on, and they start a new Jewish kingdom at that point. Now, even though the Jews have a strong measure of independence at this point, it doesn't take long before this new dynasty of Maccabean kings, the so-called Hasmoneans, begins to decline, and by the year 63 before the Common Era, the state is so weak that Pompey and his armies from Rome invade the region, and Judea becomes a client state of Rome. It is in this environment under Rome that there's tremendous factionalism among the Jewish people. There are a group called the Sadducees who basically control the temple cult. There are zealots who want to rebel against the Romans. There are the Pharisees who are essentially separating from much of the political debate and maintaining charismatic circles to try and perpetuate the Torah. Those are the people who essentially become the modern rabbis. And then, of course, there are Jewish Christians. At this point, Christianity is born. It's entirely a Jewish movement at first, and only after the first couple of centuries did it really acquire a strong non-Jewish character ethnically. And there's a lot more to say about that, but I only have 18 minutes. Okay, so the Jews rebel against Rome. They lose a major war and in the year 70, the temple is destroyed once again. They try to rebel again in the 2nd century under a man named Bar Kokhba, even more devastation, and the Romans take great pains to exile even more of the Jews. The Roman exile, which begins formally in the 1st century and extends through the 2nd century, becomes even more important and long-lasting than the earlier Babylonian exile. It is at this time, however, that the Jews decide to incorporate many of their oral teachings, which had been handed down for centuries.
All right, so like I said, it's a lot, but hang in there with me because I said there's a couple more short videos to continue that to finish it off. But I hope you're getting a better perspective here on just how deep the history goes with the Jewish people.
It is at this time, however, that the Jews decide to incorporate many of their oral teachings, which had been handed down for centuries, into a core document called the Mishnah, which eventually becomes the center of a major document called the Talmud, which we'll talk about in just a second. The Jews who are living in Babylonia, they start to flourish as Israel begins to decline under the Romans. And it is here that the Talmud is created. What is the Talmud? There's so much to say about this document, but again, 18 minutes. The Talmud is essentially a long commentary. It's a massive document, about 20 volumes, and it is essentially a commentary on the Mishnah, which is in itself sort of like an extended, primarily legal document commenting on the Torah. More to say about this, but you have to go look at the other videos, I guess. So this community begins to flourish, and it has a high point really from the 3rd through the 6th centuries. In the 7th century, Islam comes into the region, and initially the Jews actually do very well under Islam. There's a lot of cultural similarities between the ancient Jews and Muslim culture. This will ultimately decline when you get to the modern period, however. Now, what is medieval Jewish history? You can define it in a lot of different ways. I mean, we can't really apply the same parameters of Western history to the experience of the Jews, but one thing we can say for sure is the medieval period is when you see Jews begin to really spread out beyond the ancient Near East itself. Jews spreading out across the coast of North Africa, major Jewish settlements in Egypt and what would be Morocco, and then up into Spain. There are also Jewish settlements forming in Europe as well, in southern France, in northern Germany, and so on. Later, they would expand even further east to Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Poland, places like that. Jews are involved in all kinds of activities at this time. There's a whole wide range of trades, but two are especially important that make a lot of sense. One is international commerce, because Jews are, of course, at this point connected through this massive diaspora. And second is money lending, which, because of a quirk, particularly in Christian theology, Jews were essentially given several centuries of a monopoly of being the only providers of credit in all of Christian Europe. There is definitely a link between money lending and the growth of anti-Semitism, which becomes really bizarre in the medieval period. There are earlier roots to anti-Semitism beyond the scope of our 18 minutes, but in the medieval period, you really see it, particularly in Christian Europe, as Christians try to articulate the difference between the daughter religion of Christianity and the mother religion of Judaism. You see it in a lot of artwork, like the famous Ecclesia et Synagoga image, which is repeated hundreds of times throughout European art and monumental architecture, things like that. You also see it in the growth of really bizarre ideas, blood libel charge, which says that Jews somehow need to drink the blood of Christian children. I mean, that's what they call in Hebrew meshugana, totally crazy, but nevertheless, from the 13th century, this becomes a very powerful myth that pervades right up until the 20th century. So these kinds of things actually drive a lot of Jews towards Eastern Europe, where the anti-Semitism initially, at least, is quite a bit more muted. We should also mention at this point the really bizarre and fascinating story of the Jews of Spain. While the Jews are in Spain, they have this tremendous renaissance from the 9th to the 13th centuries in particular, where there was this flourishing of Jewish culture for a variety of reasons. The fact is, it's a triangular culture with Jews, Christians, and Muslims forced to interact in a non-binary way, like they would Jews versus Muslims or Jews versus Christians elsewhere in Europe. Secondly, it's on the periphery from the Muslim world, so a lot of things that could happen in Muslim Spain could not happen, let's say, in Baghdad. And there are incredible figures that rise up at this time. It declines in the 12th century with the invasion of more extremist Muslims that drive, for example, Maimonides and his family out of Spain and towards Egypt, but it represents a real high point in Jewish culture. It will unfortunately decline even further as the Christians conquer the Iberian Peninsula and institute an inquisition to try to drive out those new Christians, that is, forcibly converted Jews in the pogroms of 1391, and this ultimately results in an expulsion of Jews, a major expulsion in 1492, one of many expulsions that occurred throughout Europe for a wide variety of reasons, primarily economic in nature, driving the Jews out of Spain and throughout the Mediterranean basin. Oh my gosh, I only have about...
So we're getting there, and this last one's the shortest one of them all, but you can see, again, it's getting even deeper just how much history there is to go through and why these conversations are hard to have in a TikTok clip.
4.5 minutes left, so I got to rush through modern history. The Western European experience is quite different from the Eastern European. Western Europe tends to modernize quite a bit faster, and the Jews of Western Europe start to adopt all kinds of new technologies, like printing, for example, which is something that Jews really love to adopt right away. In Eastern Europe, there's a major uprising under a man named Bohdan Khmelnytsky in 1648. This is followed by a mass movement to follow a false messiah named Shabbatai Tzvi in the 1660s. And then about a century later, the rise of a populist movement called Hasidism, which really, made a huge impact on the experience of Jews in Eastern Europe. Rushing ahead now, when we get to the contemporary period, and by this I'm talking about the modern era, the last 100 years. Western Europe, there's been a large push towards emancipation, that is the granting of equal rights to Jews. It happens all of a sudden in France in 1791, shortly after their revolution, and then slowly begins to creep up in Germany and other countries as well. Jews begin to take advantage of this and start studying in universities and so on, and they begin to really express themselves as major members of 19th century culture. Jews are also emigrating in very large numbers from Eastern Europe to America and to a lesser degree in Israel, South Africa, and elsewhere as Russian persecution increases under the Tsars. You begin to see the development of many Jewish political movements, including that of Zionism and so on. When we get to the 20th century, certainly the most horrific moment in Jewish history as a whole is the Holocaust, when you have the combination of a devastating First World War, economic depression, and the legacy of anti-Semitism, all focused within the leadership of Adolf Hitler. And this creates a movement which we cannot possibly do justice to in such a short treatment. But the end result is, as I'm sure you're aware, 6 million Jews were killed in Eastern Europe. That's fully 1 out of 3 Jews throughout the world at the time. But in the amazing whipsaw-like nature of Jewish history, the Jews reestablished themselves in the modern state of Israel 2,000 years after their expulsion under the Romans. It's an amazing thing. Israel goes through, it's a difficult birth. Israel goes through a lot of difficult changes. They fight major wars in 1948 with independence, in 1967, the famous Six-Day War, 1973, and they have ongoing conflict with the indigenous Arab population, the Palestinians, and that is far from solved, although major steps were made with the 1993 peace accords in Oslo and with the withdrawal from Gaza, which is also a very problematic event in the year 2005. And that basically brings us up to the present day. Jews still have a tremendous amount of challenges to contend with. It is not an easy history. Nothing happens automatically. But I have managed to squeeze this under 18 minutes. And you may be wondering, why 18 minutes? Why not 20 or why not 10? Well, 18 minutes is two things. First of all, it is an easy to remember number because that's the amount of time it takes for unleavened bread to become leavened, making it not kosher for Passover. But more importantly, the number 18 is written as a word in Hebrew. The word is chai, life. So as the saying goes in Hebrew, Am Yisrael chai, the Jewish people live. I hope you found.
All right, so thank you for bearing with me through those videos there, but as I'm sure you realize now, if you did bear with me through that, there's a lot to go through in terms of the history of the Jewish people, specifically in that region, right? And this is something that maybe because it's such a long history isn't spoken about in these contexts in the modern debate, or maybe because it's being specifically left out. I'll let you decide on that. But there is information, obviously, that is not being talked about in terms of the history of the Jewish people and why they believe they have a claim to the land that they call Israel modern day, right? To summarize in an even shorter period of time than 18 minutes, which that last bit is very cool. It's something I'd like to speak on real quick, too. The Jewish faith is very deep and old, like I said, and so deep and old that even there's different levels of truth in it. Like in the writing itself, in the Hebrew language, it was designed in a way that each letter of the alphabet represents a numerical character, and there's many of them, right? And what he was describing at the end there is the word that's created from the number 18. If you take the number 18, what word is that? And he speaks of life, right? This is representative of the depth in the story of the Jewish people. I believe that there is something going on in this large diaspora over a long period of time, right? And specifically in the plight, because as they move around the world, as you hear, what they encounter is kind of consistent pain, right? Homelessness as a people. And one of the hypocrisies that I have a hard time wrapping my head around, getting more into my perspective now on what's going on, specifically with the Palestinian argument, is the idea of this is our land. It doesn't make sense to me. And this is why, right? Because the people that we refer to as Palestinian, one, have never had there's never been a state called that, Palestine, that I'm aware of. It was never sectioned off. There was never a government named that since the early 1900s, right? Since the Ottoman Empire fell. Because of that, it's very hard to identify the Palestinian people, right? Because there's no region through which they specifically come from. There's just, or state that you can identify they came from. There's just a group of people that are kind of around this area, right? And have been there at least through that period of time we're talking about, through that 1800s, 1900s. But if you look back further than that, which is again why I bring it up, I think there's a specific reason why we're only telling this story up to the late 1800s. It's because if you go further back than that, what you see is the Jewish people experiencing the exact same thing, except the roles are reversed, right? So that the Jewish people, while it may have not been specifically at the hand of the Muslim religion itself, it was at times, different tribes and things like that, the fighting over the temple, as you heard about at the very beginning, when it speaks of it, the tribes going in and destroying the initial tribes of Israel and stuff. These are different sects of older religions, not the Muslims, from what I understand, because the Muslim religion is newer than that. And this is another important piece of that, especially the argument that this is the Muslims' homeland, right? Palestine is the Muslim homeland, Holy Land, which it is in their text, not denying that. But the idea that we were there first, it makes zero sense to me, because from what I can tell, that title would go to the Jewish people if we had to identify any group of people that still exist today that were there first, right? Taking into account all of the texts we have and all of the history that we can try to find that we have nowadays, that's what it leads us to believe, that these people came out of Egypt as slaves of Egypt, which is documented to some degree, right? And settled in the lands of Israel after their journey through the desert, right? I believe in that story, and don't quote me, but I believe in that story. It wasn't like that land was completely void of people, that there were people there when they got there. But if I'm remembering right, it's the Canaanites they're referred to as, and they're a group of people that have an old religion, a polytheistic religion, if I'm not mistaken, or a different type of religion where they pray to a different god. And there's a incorporation of that culture into the Jewish culture as the land of Israel is established. So even if we go way back to then, you could say that the Jewish people displaced that group of people that was on that specific piece of land when the Israelites got there from Egypt, after their journey out of Egypt, after their exodus. So even if I go all the way back, I could even say the opposite. Well, it wasn't necessarily the Jews that were there first. There was other people there, and it could have been the Canaanites. So maybe it's their land. The problem is that group of people isn't around anymore. We don't have Canaanites or whatever they were referred to anymore, right? What we have are the modern groups of people, the modern states, the modern identities. And so what we're trying to do is say who was there first with modern terms that have no relation to the story and the root at which it comes from, which is partially why you see so much frustration coming out of the Jewish plight, because they're trying to say at some level, this is our history and this is where we came from. So I hope you as a listener here, or if you're watching right now, are starting to see how complicated this is and how there is no right or wrong in terms of this conflict. It is deeply religious at a fundamental level and deeply spiritual as well, as we'll get into when we get into the spiritual side of the podcast that comes up next here. There's an argument that's being had about who was there first that is so childish that it creates war and bloodshed, chaos, right? You can even see it with, the justification that Israel is using right now in Gaza to bomb Gaza and destroy Hamas, right? It's hypocritical because you have, this same eye for an eye. You did it first. You brutalized our people with the October 8th attacks, or 6th attacks. I can't remember the exact date. It was 6, I believe. October 6th attacks. So that justifies our actions of brutalizing your people after the fact. That is hypocritical, fundamentally. And one of the best examples of a way in which I believe the Jewish people are continually and still wrestling with God and living out their namesake of Israel. Because it does mean, as we spoke about earlier, those who wrestle with God. And that's a deep statement, those who wrestle with God. Because as, I don't know if he was a rabbi, but that person that was speaking on the Jewish history said earlier, the Jewish people are not thought of in terms of simply a culture or a religion or a language or even, a biological genetic makeup. They're thought of as the people who wrestle with God. What that means to me is that the story of the Jewish people is not the story of that group culturally or any of the other ways that we could identify them. It is the story of the human species. And it speaks of the people that wrestle with the idea of God, that wrestle with these concepts like we are doing right now, that root through them and try to find the truth in a world that is a chaotic soup. That's God's chosen people, right? And even if you are not a practicing Jew, or you have never been religious at all, if you're sitting here right now with me, doing what we're doing right now, it gets me emotional. That's what you are, right? You're God's chosen people. And that's the message that the Jewish people need to hear right now. I believe it's one of the ways that they're forgetting who they are, right? Because while I support the Jewish people and that story that I just described to you, I also believe I am one of their harshest critics, and justly, because I believe that title is something that is not held lightly by human beings or by something more divine, that there is a weight to that, a responsibility, that it is not a title that you get to show off, that you get to lord over other people. No, it's a title that you demonstrate through your plight, through your story, through the abuse you experience, right? You're God's chosen people because you choose to bear the weight of what God is for the world. And that is not something that is simply based on a religion. That is something that is true fundamentally spiritually. And you are that watching this right now. You don't have to believe in anything else except for that, to know who you are. As we move very succinctly into the spiritual side of the podcast, this is not just something that we can analyze, logically, as we've been doing for the first part of this episode. It's something that we have to think about spiritually, feel. Who are the people that are in conflict right now, and why are they so angry? And if you start to look at it from that perspective, what you'll see, and this is true at more levels than one, that the Muslim religion, and the Jewish religion, and the Christian religion for that, they are not enemies, they are not opposite sides. They're brothers and sisters. They're the same thing, exactly the same thing. And the fact that they're the same thing forces them to look at themselves in the mirror in such a way that it's almost unbearable, so unbearable that it causes a certain type of primordial reaction internally, a waking up of the demon internally that attacks that thing that it recognizes as threatening it. Because if you're like me and you're flawed, then that means I have to see mine, right? So instead of recognizing that we're the same thing and that I can heal myself through you, what do? I try to kill you, right? I try to attack you. I try to make you look like nothing so that you're irrelevant. I try to delete you, right? That's what war is.
The Israelites have escaped from the tyrant. And this is where the story, I think, becomes even more realistic. It's so profoundly and remarkably and surprisingly realistic, because it's easy for naive people to think that once you've escaped from the tyrant, you're scot-free. And the scot-freedom is you can do whatever you want, whenever you want. But it turns out that's the desert. And so Exodus story juxtaposes two extremes at the top and the bottom of human life, you might say. And one is an extreme of order, and that's tyranny, but the other is an extreme of chaos, and that's this desert-like freedom where, sure, you're free, but where are you going and which way is up?
So we see Jordan there kind of speaking very shortly about that story I'm talking about, the Exodus out of Egypt, and what it means for those people, that it is not something that is a vacation. It is the exact opposite. It is a adventure, but the most serious kind, right? A journey of finding oneself, if you were to do it individually, but as a collective of finding what and who we are, which is why it is our story as a people. This is our story as a species, right? Because I do believe that if we follow this to the very end, to the root, if we do this kind of work like we've been doing for the last hour or so, that what it'll lead us to is to recognize those similarities that I've been speaking of. And that if we have the courage, if we're strong enough, and I mean that, if we're strong enough, because that's all it takes is the will to do it. If we have the will, enough people have the will to do that, what we will do is cast out anything that is untrue. Right? We will start to dissolve this illusion. We'll start to mix that soup into something that's actually edible. Something that can sustain us, revitalize us even. And something that's a perfect mixture of all of us, right? It contains all of the pieces of us that are important and worth being there. And it gets out all of the things that would make it rot or spoil. But in order to know what will make it rot or spoil, we have to mix in the bad things. We have to assume that those are good ingredients for a little while. And man, oh man, are we making a nasty soup right now, right? But you can see in that why we shouldn't lose faith. Because it's the process at work. We're just in the middle of it, right? that I believe that the Jewish people are leading us right now, whether they know it or not, which I truly believe they don't. Maybe some. But that both in the positive and the negative way, that story is a story of us. And the story of the Muslim people is a story of us. The story of the Christian people is a story of us. And the story of every other religion that I have not named is a story of us. And they all are connected, and they're all important. I have one last video I want to share with you, because I hope we've come to a better place than we started. I by no means expect to solve the world's problems in one very short podcast episode. But what I hope we've done over this last hour or so is forced you to look at this at a deeper level, to recognize that the level that this conversation is taking place at is so shallow that if you allow yourself to accept those arguments, it will degrade you as a person. It will lead you to defend things that you don't believe in. It will lead you to justify actions that are evil. And that is true on both sides. You can see that clear as day. If that wasn't the case, there wouldn't be a war going on. All right, give me 1 second. So this is our last video here, guys. And it's Jordan Peterson speaking on this subject somewhat. But I wanted to show it because it's very powerful.
There's this scene in the Old Testament where Jacob wrestles with an angel. He's wrestling with God, actually, which is quite an interesting. That's what Israel means, right? Wrestling with God. Yeah, that just blew me away when I learned it. It's so is that true? The true people of Israel are those who wrestle with God. Yeah, it's not believe exactly. It's a whole different thing, man. It's a whole different thing.
Isn't it like fear from God? What it means? That's what I thought.
Well, it did from the work I did in the last couple of months looking at this, and I looked into it quite deeply. It does mean wrestling, essentially, and it does derive from that scene in the Old Testament where Jacob wrestles with God. That's when he gets the name Israel. There's this scene in the Old Testament.
I don't know what is going on there. There we go. Some weird interference right as that video was playing, so kind of a synchronicity there for you as we watch that. But kind of powerful, right? When you hear Israel described that way, right? That distinction that I'm sure you've made, the mistake you've made as I have most of my life, the distinction of the title of chosen people, right? It makes it seem almost egotistical. You can start to imagine why there would be such hatred inspired towards a group of people throughout history, right? Misunderstanding the meaning of that, could that lead you to project towards that group of people that maybe they're greedy or selfish, egotistical? And as they succeed more in the world, as they become more wealthy or powerful, that idea would grow. And when I look at history, that's what I see happening. Regardless of where they go in the world, you see the plight of these people as they succeed, as they group, city, wherever they are, recognizes that this small minority of people somehow seems to be well off, chosen. That would inspire, if you're not careful inside of you, a certain type of bitterness and jealousy, especially if you're not working on yourself emotionally. And if you're not careful, you project that at them, first emotionally and then physically. And that happened over and over and over and over and over again. So there's got to be something true in that, right? How else would you explain the motivation to do what we have done to the Jewish people throughout history? I'm going to end the show by kind of taking it to the Bible, and one of the very important stories in the Bible. It's also in the Torah. It's where the Bible gets it from. It's the story of Cain and Abel. And for those of you that aren't familiar, Cain, it's one of the foundational stories in Genesis, I believe, which speaks of the creation of man, right? And Cain and Abel are the sons of Adam and Eve. So they are the first in the story of creation in Genesis, they are the first human beings that were born of human beings. Because Adam and Eve in the story are created by God directly, right? So they're not born like a traditional human being. But Cain and Abel are. They're born. So they're the first human beings in that story. And what you see with the story of Cain and Abel is very peculiar because it's a simple story, oddly simple on the surface, and kind of barbaric, sad, depressing, because in this story, Cain and Abel have a relationship with God. In this story, in this part of the Bible, God is a direct thing that interacts with its children. And so God has this relationship with Cain and Abel, and that relationship is based on sacrifice, right? So the Cain and Abel bring sacrifices to God to maintain that relationship. And the idea is that you bring, whatever you think sufficient, a sacrifice to God. God asks for the sacrifice, and he allows you to decide what you think is sufficient. And so Cain brings, I believe, his best lamb, and Abel brings his crop. And God chooses the crop. And this happens a couple more times. And as it happens, Cain starts to grow bitter. He starts to question, why is God not choosing my sacrifice? Why is mine not sufficient? And the Bible doesn't go into why. It doesn't tell you why it's insufficient. It lets you think that, figure that out, right? But what happens is you see a very familiar devolving internally play out in one of the oldest stories we have as human beings. Something that you can experience inside of yourself, and I'm sure you have, as you've felt yourself become bitter and jealous of anybody. Watch what happens inside of your head. Watch the ideas that start to play around. Watch where you go and take them, the dark places you'll take them, and the things you'll imagine doing to them, right? Cain in this story acts on those, and he kills his brother Abel out of bitterness and jealousy that God shined favorably on Abel. And what ends up happening is God learns this, becomes angry at Cain, and banishes Cain, curses his line, essentially. And what's so fascinating about that is Cain, because Abel died, is the originator of the species from that point on. In that story, Cain is the father of all of us, right? Which, if you really think about it, because it explains exactly why you've experienced what I just told you did, right? How I knew you did, how I've experienced it too, because that's where we come from. There's this idea that we're fundamentally good things, and that all we need to do is get out of our own way, right? And then we'd all just be happy, and the world would be a nice place. But I'm here to tell you, unfortunately, that is not true. And I know this because I've learned it myself very deeply, in the pits that I've fallen into, in the ways I've watched myself turn into a demon myself. And I mean that. The things that I've seen go through my head, the things I've watched myself do to this world and other people in that place, are things that I would never want to say out loud. But things that deserve to be shown in the light of day. Because they're things that every single human being experiences. They are demons that hide because we are too scared to say that we have them. Right. Israel. God's chosen people. This is what we struggle with. There is no other reason for the wickedness in the world except for you. That's the truth. It's not Hamas. It's not the Muslim religion. It's not the Jews. It's not the Christians. It's you. And it's always been you. And it's always been me. And the secret is we can figure out the simple truth that we control those things in our own lives. We can stop it. And that's beautiful. And that's the promised land that was promised the Jewish people. It is not something I believe this wholeheartedly, so deeply, it gets me emotional when I think about it, that God did not mean what the Jewish people thought it meant when it said, this land will be yours. I'm paraphrasing, right? When it guaranteed Israel to the Jews. I believe what it meant was earth. Israel is earth when properly realized. God's chosen people. There's not one of you that are watching right now or aren't watching right now, doesn't matter where you are in the world, how wicked you are, or how far from grace you are. You're God's chosen people. We have forgotten that. We can't see that anymore. There's periods in history where we've seen glimpses of it. But this tendency to burn it down has consumed us. This idea that something outside of us will come and save us before we destroy ourselves has been something we've latched onto, pushed our responsibility away as a species, but it is our responsibility to stop this. There's no God out there that is coming to save you or me. You save you. We save us. And when we do that, that's when we meet God. And only then. And so I hope through this episode, you have come to gain a larger understanding of why the conflict that is going on in Israel, in Gaza, is so important. Why it is apocalyptic. And why a lot of the things you've been seeing about this conflict that speak in spiritual and biblical terms is true. Because it is a culmination of this story, right? The trick is, it doesn't have to be a tragedy. And I believe if you look through all of the texts that we have, that what's prophesied for us is what we dream of, the promised land. The only problem is you have to choose it. God can't make you, right? So if we live in a world of everything besides that, everything that would degrade you and everything that would make you something other than what you are, how can you ever find that promised land? How could you ever see it? You have to cast those things off. You have to choose that. And that is the separation that is taking place right now. If you're watching this, choose that. You already are by watching this, right? So I pray for you. I pray for the Muslim people, the Palestinian people that are suffering right now. I pray for the Israel people, the Israelis, the Jewish people that were brutalized on October 6th, and all of the suffering that's taken place throughout history for those people. Truly, I wish I could take it away. I wish World War I went differently. I wish people had more consideration for the millions of lives that you'll destroy over the next century by moving people around and creating states that don't exist. I think my message would be right now to the Jewish people, listen. There's a reason you've been given that title, and God is speaking right now. But I think he's letting you sort it out, figure out which one's real. He can't make it for you. I'm going to close with this. I was raised Roman Catholic, which is partially why I have a tertiary understanding of the Jewish faith, but I'm by no means an expert. But a very critical part of the Jewish story is a prophecy. It's a prophecy of a Savior, one that's spoken of very early on, one that we even have archetypes for, people that come before, that are supposed to be examples of what we should look for in a Savior when we see one. And this prophecy is so fundamental to the Jewish faith that it as you heard in some of that history, actually has led groups of the Jewish people astray at certain times, false prophets. One of those false prophets that the Jewish people would refer to as a false prophet, I believe, or not necessarily prophet, but a false savior, was Jesus. And if you're familiar with the story of Jesus, you'll recognize that while he was Jewish himself, he was not the Jewish faith was not a fan of him. The Jewish religion was not a fan of him. As a matter of fact, the Pharisees, the leaders of the Jewish faith, are the people that turned Jesus in and had him executed. Specifically, if you read that part of the Bible, because he questions and calls out those leaders for their hypocrisy. So he's not even questioning the fundamentals of the faith. He's questioning the leaders that speak on the faith and say they are the keepers of the faith, on their hypocrisy, on their inability to keep their own rules. This is what he's murdered for. Now, why I'm bringing this up is because I believe it's a very critical part of the story, and I believe it's partially why the Jewish people are experiencing the pain they're experiencing right now. This is just my opinion. This is something, granted, that I have gotten through download. This is not something I've just made up in my head. This is something that I believe in. But I believe that if you look at the story of Jesus through a certain context and certain perspective, what you'll realize is that the Jewish people and the Torah was correct, prophesied a Savior. I believe that Savior came, Jesus Christ, and that Savior tried to tell the Jewish people through the Pharisees where they were going wrong and how to get to the promised land. Not only them, but he tried to show everybody, and he was murdered. Now, this is what's critical. He was killed by the Jewish leaders, right? He was voted for by the Jewish people. So, for a second, I want you to entertain the idea that that person, Jesus Christ, was the Savior that was prophesied. What would that mean for the Jewish people after that happened, after he was killed? What I've realized when I think through that and try to place myself in that position, and you see this in the story of the crucifixion of Jesus, specifically immediately after he dies, a sorrow come over not only the people that are there, but kind of the collective world, a mourning. And I believe this is not just a mourning for the individual that just passed. I believe it's a mourning for the mistake that was made. Because if that is one of the fundamental things that you are waiting for in your religion, you're looking for, and it finally gets here, and you misjudge and kill it, what does that mean for you going forward? Now, if you take this timeline and move it forward from the time that Jesus died, what you see the Jewish people go through is the plight that we just heard about, of going around the world and being subjugated and tortured in different cruel ways. But operating on the same assumptions that you did before Jesus came, not implementing the changes that he spoke of. This is why I talk about it, to bring me to this very specific point. There is a major difference between the Christian religion and the Jewish religion, and this is one of the major points. It's in the laws, what is right and wrong. And this is very subtle. I don't think many people pick up on this, but in the Jewish religion, in the Old Testament, it speaks of a law, a fundamental moral law of eye for an eye, right? That if somebody harms you, you have a right to exact the same on them. Not more, the same, right? And this idea at the time, thousands of years ago, was true to some degree, right? If you're in a hostile environment where everybody's predators, essentially, you have to get to a point where you won't just murder them, right? Especially if they're trying to take something from you. So you get to this certain type of equity where it won't make things worse at the very least. I steal from you, well, you stole from me, okay. It kind of dissolves. But if you carry that forward, it doesn't apply well to all situations, because it continues the violence, it continues the stealing, right? Because you can do it back to them. So you just keep doing it, right? It's a huge logical hole in that law. Now that's still the same law, from what I understand in the Torah. There was never an amendment to that. But what specifically, Jesus speaks against that law when he comes. He specifically talks about turning the other cheek, which is a completely different process than eye for an eye. Turning the other cheek is they do that to me and I walk away. That's what Jesus speaks of as true and good and righteous and godly. You can start to understand why that criticism would be something that would be taken harshly. It's a hard thing to digest. If your moral structure is going to be fundamentally rocked at the core, not only is it going to be rocked at the core culturally, but you as an individual are not, there's more demanded of you. You don't get to go steal again if they steal from you. You have to be the bigger person. And that's a huge weight, a massive weight, especially imagine if you've never had that concept before. He's delivering this concept to the human race. The human race is going, are you fucking kidding me? No, you die. See? I bring this up not to criticize the Jewish people, because that is an incredible thing to try to conceptualize, internalize, and incorporate. But that's what happened. It's the wrong kind of reaction. The same one that had been going on for centuries, all of human history, the predator. And so as we move forward throughout Jewish history, like I said, you see this plight, this diaspora, this homelessness. And I don't know what the truth is, but I often wonder if that was a mistake. It was a mistake. I don't wonder, I know it was. Anybody that reads, listens to, watches The Passion of the Christ will recognize immediately that was the wrong decision. How has the Jewish faith not recognized that? There's a responsibility there that isn't being recognized and has been pushed off for thousands of years at this point, that needs to be recognized so it can be released, so that the Jewish people can finally find their home, so we can stop wrestling in that way. And with that, that's going to be the Unfounded Podcast for today, guys. I want to thank you for hanging in there with me, because I know this is a heavy topic and there was a lot to get through, especially those long videos. But if you did stick around with me through all of that, I hope that you've come to the other side with a greater understanding, a more dynamic understanding of what's going on in the Middle East and with the religions specifically. Please, if you want to support me, check out my pages. I had somebody reach out to me not too long ago on Instagram, let me know that the support icon on my podcast page was kind of messed up and goofy. So I checked into that, got everything set up properly again. If you want to support my work, you can do it a couple of different ways. I do have a Patreon. All you have to do is check out the Unfounded Podcast on Patreon, and you'll find it there. You can support me through there. I will be posting stuff on there that I don't post other places. I have one specific reading, actually. It's about an hour and a half long, or probably about 45 minutes long, that I was making for subscriptions when I was going to do subscriptions in Spotify, and I just didn't have enough traffic on it. So that's an example of a video you'll have access to on the Patreon if you choose to support that way. But you can also choose to support me through my Linktree. That's Linktree/ChrisTheSage. It's a kind of a launch pad for all of my other content. So anything that you want to keep up with on me, just go to that page, the Linktree, and you'll see links to all of my other platforms and music and anything else I'm producing, you'll see on there. But you can also support me on there through a tip jar. There's a tip jar right at the very top. You can choose how much you'd like to donate, and that helps me out massively. TikTok, if you follow me on TikTok, you can tip me on there. But also, last but not least, on Spotify, you can. On my Spotify page, the main podcast web page, there's a support link there. If you click that support link, it'll pop up a box. And the only downside to Spotify is it's a monthly subscription. So it's a support for every month. So that's why I tell you about the other options, because I know many people don't want to continually donate a specific amount every month. So if you just like to help me out one time, that's perfectly fine. Just use one of those other links. But I wanted to get through that before I said goodbye here too, because I often forget to talk about the more technical aspects of the podcast. So I hope you all been enjoying the content. As you can see, I'm getting it out in more places. Check out YouTube, check out Rumble, check out Instagram, because I'm putting different content on all of it. And follow me on all of those, because as the social media platform landscape changes, specifically like on TikTok, if that goes away, I want to be able to get to you and for you to find me when you want to. So follow me on as many of the platforms as you can. If you feel like it, leave me a comment, a like, a share, subscribe on the podcast. If you can rate it, it helps me out massively. So all of that would go a long way to put the podcast in front of more people. So that's what I got for today, guys. I'll be back on here at the very least in another week. I don't have another idea yet, but we'll generate one in the process. And we'll get deeper into another topic. There's tons of them that I've been putting on the back burner for the last 6 months, so it's not like I'm going to have any shortage, but I got to see which one hits me intuitively, like, oh yeah, we need to deep dive that now. So, but I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'm sure we'll probably actually go into it deeper at some point in the future as well. But have a good rest of your week. I send you a lot of love. Bye-bye.